is Dion Polera, and I'm an assistant professor at the Johnson Scheiman Graduate School of Public Policy and a fellow with the Center for the Study of Co-ops. And on this project, I was part of the project management group. And the presentation that I'll be giving for you today is Community Characteristics and Wellbeing in Western Canada. And so for those of you who know me, you know that I'm a total data geek, and I learned a lot about qualitative research from this project, but I was so excited for the last week how Tao and I have been able to just run regressions and look at data, quantitative data, so we've been in our glory, right, Hao Tao? Yeah. And I also, so thank you to Hao Tao very much and everyone else on the project for helping with this. And also I have to also mention that my MPP student Miranda Gushi is doing her thesis on this exact topic, so a lot of what I'm presenting today has been the result of conversations and some of the work that she's been doing. So I'm going to start by saying we've talked a lot about co-op development and the factors that contribute to successful co-op development in may contribute to successful co-op development in Western Canada. But to back it up a step and say, you know, what we're talking about here is also related to community development. And for both community and co-op development to be successful, requires really two things. It requires both community and co-op developers to address and take into account core features of the community. And they also have to be able to, in order to do this, recognize the differences that exist across communities. And I think that both Darcy and Marie outlined this in their previous presentations. They also have to do work that helps build capacity in the community so that the communities can become empowered to really address and be able to access the available tools and resources to be able to actually solve their own needs. And this contributes to sustainability of these kinds of development initiatives. Community and co-op development both take a substantive amount of dedicated time and effort and sometimes and oftentimes financial resources. And we have to always remember that both community and co-op development are simply means to an end. The goal ultimately is to improve resident well-being and quality of life. The goal is not to create new social enterprises or new co-ops. The goal is ultimately to improve well-being and quality of life. So the CIP project investigated community characteristics important for creating a favorable environment for co-op development, and Darcy went through all of those. But we need to also remember that successful co-op development isn't just about creating co-ops. It must also meet community needs and build community capacity. And this will help create new co-ops, as we've discussed, but it ultimately has to be to enhance well-being. So part of what we've been talking about in other presentations we've given at other points throughout the project have really focused on how co-op knowledge and community needs and social and business capacity contribute to co-op development, but co-op development has to work the other way too in order for it to be successful. But you know, really what we ultimately care about is we still need to establish if we address needs and build community capital and build social and business capacity in the communities, that this will ultimately improve well-being. Because if that's the end goal, we have to sort of know that that's maybe what will hopefully come out of the project. So some of the work that's been done in this area that we've drawn a little bit on in this project, but much more systematically recently. One framework is the Community Capitals Framework, and Emery and Flora talked about this framework in 2006, and they identified 7 different types of capital that matter for community development. And the Community Capitals Framework really separates these different types of community capitals into 2 types, market and non-market. So the market types of capital are built capital, the infrastructure, financial capital, which we know what that is, natural capital, which is the resources and beauty in the community, and the human capital, which often we think of as education and skills. And the non-market are things that we've also been talking about, the social, cultural, and political capital in these communities. And what this framework talks about is how these community capitals interact with each other, that when you have the presence of one capital in a community, it can create other types of capital. They also talk about how these community capitals are related to community needs. So in some cases, we often think about community capitals as being unequivocally positive. But community capitals can also be negative for addressing community needs. So if there's a high degree of social capital between one group in a community, but it ostracizes other groups in the community, this can actually create negative outcomes for being able to address needs and for improving well-being. And so there are, in general, we think about capitals as improving quality of life and well-being ultimately, but we have to sort of think about the nature of them and how that particular community is leveraging them. Now, in our study, our current measures of capacity, of business and social capacity, do overlap with the capitals in this framework. We really are focusing on measuring one market capital in the form of business capacity and one non-market capital in the form of social capacity. In the community capitals literature, interestingly enough, nobody's really looked and explored this link between community capitals and well-being. There is a well-established theoretical link. Everybody thinks that it actually will increase well-being, but it actually hasn't. It's really been underexplored empirically. So we don't have a lot of good data on this. A lot of the data comes from, and very good data comes from case studies, but these are anecdotal experiences in one particular community. These frameworks and community characteristics are often thought of assets or capitals, but they're primarily used for community asset mapping, so saying what a community has or doesn't have. But the methodological limitations in tying it to well-being come because well-being is highly subjective. It matters who you ask about well-being in a community. Common indicators we use particularly for policy making are around the GDP, education levels, and they don't tell us about people's lived experiences or people's ability to access things in the community. And any well-being measures that are collected are often aggregated and thus not very useful to be able to actually talk about people's lived experiences in a community. Now, CIP, this wasn't initially, I think it was really fortunate. We didn't systematically set out to sort of do this kind of study, but we did collect systematic information in the telephone and web surveys, which I'll talk about in a second, about subjective well-being. And so we're able to sort of be one of the first studies that can actually make this link. So the key questions here that form the basis for this analysis really were threefold, and we're still doing analysis. There's so much data, and there are so many regressions. My head is spinning. So I'm going to try and sort of really give you just the basics today, and if you have any questions or comments about ways that we can move forward, that would be great as well. So the first question is, are there reported differences in the subjective well-being between rural and Aboriginal communities and between the provinces? So that's one of the first questions we sought to answer. So just an examination of the descriptives around well-being, reported well-being in the communities. And then the second question is, what are the relationships between the community characteristics, and in this case, we're talking about needs, social and business capacity, and well-being in Western Canada. And the third question is, do the relationships between these community characteristics and well-being differ between communities? So, for instance, do certain characteristics or factors matter more in rural versus Aboriginal communities, or less in some provinces than others? So these were all questions that we sought to answer with this analysis. So this is really just the way I think about doing empirical research. So you're trying to establish a link between community needs, social and business capacity, and well-being, and what the nature of that relationship looks like, and if that varies by community type and province. So again, we love this graph. It really is quite amazing. So as you can see, all the stars and the green circles. The green circles are the web survey that we did, and the stars are the telephone survey. And I'll talk a little bit about the methodology behind each. So for the telephone survey, initially we had 2,025, but because of missing data and a number of other reasons, ended up with a final sample of 1,756 respondents for a response rate, an overall response rate of 21%, which is pretty decent. There are roughly equal numbers from each province because we stratified it and forced it to be that way. The Aboriginal response rate was quite good, but it's important to know that the way that we measured Aboriginal in the telephone survey was based on a self-reported question of status. So this slightly differs from Aboriginal communities in the sense that a lot of these respondents who reported Aboriginal status are actually from rural communities and not from Aboriginal communities. So we had a lower response rate for Aboriginal people from Aboriginal communities. So it's a slightly different nature of the data compared to some of the other data we've collected. Compared to the census data, however, our sample is fairly representative. We have a slight bias towards an older demographic in the telephone survey and a higher education level, which in terms of the older demographic, we see that a lot in these kinds of telephone surveys. For the web survey, we we sent emails. We collected emails via internet and other sources to get emails for all the town band administrators in our study population, which took forever. Thank you to the team. And we sent them emails and asked them to complete a web survey. And we had a response rate of 22%, which if you do any kind of web-based research, you know that that's extremely high. We had a lower response rate from Aboriginal communities compared with rural, and we did have some differences in the response rate across the provinces. But overall, we were fairly happy with our response rate and representativeness of our samples. So the measures, and I can go into more detail into the exact nature of the questions, but we measured community needs. We measured needs in a variety of different ways, access to programs, but today I'm just going to talk about basic needs. We measured various aspects of social capacity. Two of the variables I'm going to focus on today are sense of safety and security and willingness to work together. We measured business capacity, access to financial and capital, other types of human capital, skills, education. And well-being, we measured two questions: quality of life, perceived quality of life, and perceived satisfaction, or their satisfaction with their community. I'm only going to focus on the quality of life today in interest of time. We also have the community type, rural and Aboriginal, again noting the slight difference in how we define rural in the telephone survey, and province. So the results, the relationship between community capacities and needs. Our results are consistent in this area with the research on community capitals. We saw that there was a positive relationship between social and business capacity. So where one exists, the other follows. And you're not really sure about the nature of the causal effect there, but that they tend to go together. And there is a negative correlation, a strong negative correlation between community capacities and needs. So you can see in this graph of the telephone survey, as need for basic services goes up along the bottom axis here, business capacity and social capacity in these two ways we measured it go down. So you can see that negative correlation there. Same pattern of relationships in the web survey. So that's consistent, and we've reported that result elsewhere at other presentations we've done. Moving into a description of well-being, Aboriginal respondents report a significantly lower quality of life than rural respondents across both the telephone and web surveys, and this was a very significant difference, and I'll show you the graphs in a second. The quality of life ratings from the web survey of administrators is slightly lower than the residents. We are still investigating the differences across the respondents, but short form is that it depends who you it matters who you ask about well-being in the community. And there are some differences showing up across the provinces that merit further investigation. I'll just highlight some of them here, but we're still investigating some of the reasons for that. So you can see the descriptions, the mean of, and so the higher on the vertical axis here, the higher the number, the higher the mean of quality of life in the reported respondents. So you can see a substantive difference between rural and Aboriginal communities in terms of reported quality of life for the telephone survey. You can see, and I'll actually move forward, so you can see the same relationship, although more pronounced in the web survey for quality of life. When you move across provinces on the telephone survey, this is interesting. There's not much difference between Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta in terms of reported quality of life from respondents in the communities. British Columbia, however, is significantly higher. Interestingly enough, though, when you move to the town administrators or band administrators, BC is the lowest. And so, again, it matters who you ask, and also that there's something strange about BC or unique about BC. If anyone's calling him from BC, it's because it's a good uniqueness, I'm sure. We also can break down rural and Aboriginal across the provinces with the telephone survey because we do have enough data to do so. And so you can see the systematic lower quality of life reported for Aboriginal communities across all provinces. And again, fairly similar quality of life with BC being slightly higher in the rural communities. I do have this graph as well at the for the web survey, but as how Tao and I don't trust this data as much because there's a lower percentage, a lower number of respondents when you break it out for the web survey. We just had a lower number of town and band administrators, and so we don't trust this data as much, but you can still see systematically lower quality of life reported in rural communities across the provinces, and very little difference in terms of the rural communities across the provinces. One interesting thing is that Saskatchewan appears to systematically be fairly low, slightly lower in the quality of life reported and data in the Aboriginal communities. So moving on, that's the descriptives around quality of life. The factors affecting well-being, community need is negatively related to quality of life. We found this fairly systematically across all the data, and social and business capacity are both positively related to quality of life. So you can see here the relationships. Quality of life is on the bottom. As quality of life goes up, need for basic services goes down. Or it's probably, in reality, as the need for basic services goes down, the perceived quality of life goes up. And the same with business capacity and social capacity. They go up as quality of life goes up as well. So there's a positive correlation there. And that's across both the telephone and web survey. Finally, the factors that affect well-being appear mostly the same between rural and Aboriginal communities across provinces. So the pattern of these relationships doesn't actually change that much. There are a few minor differences that we're still investigating across the provinces, but on the whole, it seems that community needs negatively high, when the community needs are higher, quality of life is lower across all communities, which, so it's not that, there may be some differences that we can look at in terms of certain types of needs may have more importance in certain communities, like say in rural communities, and some of that will come out of doing some additional analysis of this based on, some of the findings we found in the qualitative research that can help us sort of think through this more systematically. But there are some minor differences in importance of certain factors in some provinces. So in some provinces, certain factors matter more than others. So in some provinces, business capacity matters more for quality of life, and in some provinces, social capacity matters more for quality of life. But those are things that we're still really investigating and needs a little bit more time. The one thing we do know that even though we're seeing fairly similar patterns in how these things affect communities, as Darcy pointed out, based on data from the community meetings, and this is why, the mixed methods approach to this data is so powerful, we do know that, you can't sort of tell the whole story based on numbers alone, because each community does see and value its unique strengths and challenges in a way that isn't apparent from the data I've presented here. And there are unique historical, geographical, and economic factors shaping communities, so their needs aren't the same. But there are patterns that are occurring across provinces, as Murray pointed out, and across rural and Aboriginal communities. And ultimately, we can say that if we do address community needs and increase social and business capacity, it's highly likely that quality of life and subjective well-being in these communities will improve. I'll leave it at that, and does anybody have any questions?
So the telephone survey, when you said there was a response rate of 21%, does that mean, I'm not quite sure how you administered this. If you would phone, and if you got an answer, if you didn't get an answer, you just went on. You didn't try to phone back ever?
So that's a really good question, Nora. So the maximum response rate, you can report the response rate in different ways on the telephone survey. So the maximum response rate is 21% because we got rid of essentially all of the people that didn't, like lots of the people they initially phoned, their numbers aren't in service anymore, okay. or they're actually not in a rural CSD the way okay. that we get their numbers, and so the maximum response rate is 22%, but it's likely slightly lower than that because some people just won't answer.
Right. Okay. So they don't answer the phone, or they refuse to answer. They answer the phone, but refuse to answer the questions.
Yes. If they refuse to answer, then that's actually what we've calculated the response rate on. Okay. In terms of that and removing people who didn't respond to quite a large number of questions. Right. So the response rate is likely somewhere lower in that, but we can't actually calculate the exact response rate. But that's a great question. Yeah.
So we have a question online from Marie Paul, and she asks, how do physical communities maintain their usefulness in the context of community of interest? Can community of interest be the focus to developing local economies? And how working from the community of interest, I guess, perspective, can it serve the physical community's need?
So the one thing I will say, and maybe Darcy can speak to it better, but in our community meetings, we did actually ask them to identify what they perceived their community to be. And so I don't know if that's what she's asking with the community of interest question, but if...
It might be like a social interest. Is that how you're understanding it? Rather than a geographical one? So a social issue, perhaps, that is larger than a geographical area?
So yeah, that's interesting in terms of actually thinking about the community. The question is, I think, too, we talked a lot about this in the project around thinking about communities as larger than just a small, geographically bounded community. And many people, as Darcy pointed out in her earlier presentation, aren't thinking of their community just as their geographically bounded ones. So they share similar needs to other communities that are close in geographic distance. But generally speaking, people still think about their community as bounded by a geography. They don't really think about it. I don't think people, say, across provinces think about their community as, if I'm in Saskatchewan in a particular area, thinking about my community as Albertans who are facing the same kinds of issues. But I don't know if that's exactly what she's...
Or what if it was about sort of environmental issues or something that's larger and there's a community of people who are concerned, have that concern and share that concern, that's larger than a geographical community.
So one of the things that came out of our results in various ways was this need or to start thinking about how Aboriginal and rural communities across a broader region could get together to solve some of these broader issues and bigger issues that can't be addressed just by one community alone. And some communities are starting to think along these lines. And I think they probably need a little bit more support and prodding to be able to, would you agree with that, to start to think along these lines? Because I think there is still a tendency for people to think about the very geographically bounded nature of their community. Although it was larger than we thought it would be, I think are the two things. You agree? You're shaking your head, so I'm going to assume that that's correct. Yeah.
Do you want to do more than shake your head? Do you want the mic?
Just maybe in terms of something like environmental need, for example, or needs around protecting the environment to create a better quality of life or better well-being. Most of the questions that we directed towards people were based first thinking about their own community. And so any questions that we had about environmentalism, for example, would be around what can you do within your own community to improve the environmental status within your community. So we weren't really looking at measuring those really wide global, across all of Western Canada, how do we, form some sort of a way or a social movement to fix the environment. So it was a little bit outside the scope of what we were able to do.
That's it for questions? Okay, excellent, thank you.
All right. Final presentation for this afternoon. What I want to do in this presentation is kind of bring everything together and talk about cooperative development. We've heard, we've got a bit of an overview of what Western Canada looks like. We've got a sense of what these communities are saying about social capacity and business capacity and needs. We have a nice sense of how needs line up with, and capacity lines up with social well-being. Where does co-op development fit in all of this? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what Federated Co-ops was interested in. What can we do to actually develop co-ops in Western Canada? In some ways, this is the conclusions to that major question that Federated had posed to us right at the beginning of this research. So the place to start is to actually go back to where Darcy kind of left us, saying there are 4 dimensions to cooperative development. The well-defined needs, social capacity, business capacity, and knowledge of the cooperative model. What Darcy spent some time talking about was the first 3. She didn't talk about the last one, the knowledge of the cooperative model, and we left it to talk about it now because this is the one that really fits into cooperative development, and hence it's now rather than earlier in the presentation. So here's the word cloud around knowledge of co-ops. Here's just a few little data points that are kind of interesting. One of the questions we asked was, do you know what a cooperative is? This was in the telephone survey. And these are the responses that we got. These are the percentage of people who answered no, or they did not know what a cooperative was. And we were not terribly surprised that the knowledge in Aboriginal communities might be as kind of low as it is, because we have 40% plus people saying they simply don't know what a co-op is. But you're getting 24%, almost 25% on average across Western Canada of people in rural communities saying we don't know what a co-op is. And yet there are co-ops in virtually every one of these communities. And we knew that over time, this sort of cooperative knowledge had been eroding. But I think we were even a bit surprised that it had eroded as much as it had. Some of the themes that came out, and this is from the qualitative information that we got from the community meetings, so this is the discussions that we were having at the meetings. People would see the co-op, and they understood co-op as retail store, gas bar, credit union, but that's what their knowledge was. It was of a particular co-op, not of what a co-op is. They could not say what made a co-op different from other business models. They could not talk about the strengths and weaknesses of a co-op. Now, there were some pockets of, there were areas, geographical areas where this was different, and that was really correlated where there had been a lot of cooperative development. But in other places where there hasn't been much activity in this area, you're seeing very, very, what we think are very low levels. Now, at the same time, when we got out into these communities and we started to actually have a conversation with people about co-ops, we found that, in fact, they would respond actually very positively. They became actually quite excited. And they were actually able to come up with some unique applications of the cooperative model, but it took prompting on our part. They would not have got to those points without the assistance of the people that were those of us that were administering and looking after the meeting. And these are the areas where there was some strong interest in co-ops once you started to have the conversation. So this is what actually has led us to the conclusion that although the level of knowledge is fairly low, there is still a great deal of interest, and there is a willingness on the part of people to actually go there. It's just that they haven't gone there for some time. Now, there may be other explanations, but we think that that one's the one that fits with what we hear in other areas. So this then sets us up to actually talk about co-op development. Given that this is the background, what do we need for co-op development over this next, say, 10, 15, 20 years if we're going to actually be successful? If this is the starting point, what do we have to do? Well, we need to connect up the community needs with the business and the social capacity. We know that that's going to be a critical aspect. We're going to need local champions in these communities. We're going to need to broaden and deepen that knowledge of the cooperative model, understand the strengths and weaknesses, and overcome a number of community barriers or apathy or whatever in the process. So this is in part the task that awaits co-op developers in the future. So with that as kind of the setting, Let me talk about who's actually doing co-op development today. And there's actually, there is a fair bit of activity going on. The provincial associations and their affiliates are doing the most. All of the provinces have a co-op, at least one co-op developer, at least part-time, they have at least one co-op developer. This is both Anglophone and, pardon me, Francophone. The provincial government in Manitoba has some staff that they have dedicated to co-op development. There are a number of independent co-op developers doing this as part of a business model. Some of the First Nations economic development organizations are now becoming engaged in cooperative development. You see some of the federations like the Worker Co-op Federation or the Housing Co-op Federation doing some co-op development work. There's some work in some of the existing co-ops and credit unions, and Cooperative Mutuals Canada, the apex organization of co-ops, has a bit of an initiative around cooperative development. But I think it is safe to say that none of this work is coordinated. And Merle's nodding, so this is good, because we're relying on the great work that she did, actually digging out and talking to the people. This is not coordinated in any way, shape, or form. And we think one of the conclusions that we've come to is that if you're going to be successful in co-op development, you really need to bring these various players together in a way that they haven't been up until now. Just to give you a bit of a sense of how much co-op development has actually occurred in Western Canada over the last 15 years, there have been some co-ops that have been developed. What I think is fascinating, I think all the members of the team find fascinating, is that these things, they're clustered by province. So in Manitoba, utilities and arts and recreation, 21 out of the 49 co-ops were in those two sectors, which says this isn't a random process. This is a process that likely is network-based. And so somebody's getting an idea, an innovation, they're starting an idea, and then it's spreading through a network of people, either through co-op developers, but I suspect through community networks. And we actually, this is something that, looking back on it, we should have been paying more attention to, with some of the community networks that are going on, because this is actually saying, I think that these are very important. And Peter, we need to talk about this and seeing if you're finding the same thing in the UK. That's something to think about. But you can go through all the provinces, and there is this constellation of activity in very specific sectors. Social assistance, I think. I think it's social assistance. Now we know that co-ops, so we've been through this. Co-ops require social and business capacity. And this, again, is just a repeat of the stuff that we've heard this afternoon. Communities are displaying substantial differences, and Aboriginal communities are, in general, having lower levels of these activities, these things. Let me just talk a little bit about, and again, this is kind of pulling all the stuff together, but if you take a look at co-op development and you think about some co-op development that's going to be robust, that's going to be really long-lasting, what we know is that it's at the same time going to be, it needs to be an active process where there's people actively engaged in this. It needs to be a lengthy process, not just in and out, but sustained over a period of time when this co-op gets established, is actually formed, and then on into its operation. And it's a profoundly political process. And I'm just going to talk about each of these for a moment. So on the active part, what we found from talking to the co-op developers and from talking to the people in the community is that we firmly believe that you need community-based agents that are out there talking about cooperative development. You need people in these communities that are actually engaging people in those conversations, the ones that we started to have in our community visits. These conversations need to be happening a lot more often than they do. If you're going to rely on groups spontaneously picking up the co-op idea and then saying, oh, I'm going to pick up my phone and phone somebody and because I'm going to want to know how to form a co-op, you're not going to get very many co-ops. And in some ways, that's what people are relying on in many of the communities across Western Canada. There are a few communities where there is some active activity going on by somebody embedded within that community, and we think there needs to be a lot more. So that's the active part. The lengthy process is that this does take time, and you do need some resources that are in place for a considerable length of time. And you also, we think, need, this is a point I made in the last slide, we need a pan-Western Canadian mandate, because many of the activities that need to be invested in, but not all of them, actually have what I think as an economist I would call it, they have economies of scale. And so if you can develop them once, you can then use them across all of Western Canada. And we need to think about what are those activities that we can develop and then really share across the whole area. I'm going to talk about the political process in just a moment. In fact, right now. Darcy, I think, mentioned this about the role of gatekeepers, but this was something that came up very, very strongly in our community meetings. And in fact, the organizing of the community meetings, not just actually once we got there, but in fact, just actually organizing them. Some communities we found it was an absolute breeze to organize. People say, yep, we can do that. In other communities, it was a real chore. We knew that we were getting active resistance of people posting posters, putting up announcements and so forth. In fact, in one of the cases, we were told that we could not actually enter the community. It would not be, because they had their own planning process underway, and we were going to be interfering with that particular process. And so we didn't go to that particular community. And this got us thinking about what we are now calling gatekeepers, these people that are in positions of power and authority within communities. Now, I know Lou's sitting here. She's written about the gatekeepers in Aboriginal communities, and they're certainly present there, particularly at councils, band councils, but they're also present in rural communities. And they may be formal political structures, but they may also be informal networks that if you're not part of, you don't get the same sort of attention. And we think that this is something that actually has to be a part of the conversation around cooperative development right from the get-go. I know when Merle talks to the co-op developers, when she pressed them on this, they say, oh yeah, we understand the politics. But nobody talks about it until you actually raise the question. And we think it actually needs to be brought out and made part of the way that people actually conceptualize cooperative development. And you actually have to think about cooperative development as being a political activity. What this particular slide is saying, what we need is, there's two things we need here. We need some specialized knowledge of co-ops. So co-op developers, when they go out into these communities, they need, in some cases, some very specialized knowledge, perhaps of incorporation, what they can do with the cooperative model. In other cases, it's legal advice in terms of what they can do around, in, say, an Aboriginal community. They may need some particular knowledge of financing in other cases. So there's some technical knowledge that's needed. That's part of the toolbox that's required. But there's also a toolbox of ideas of the cooperative model and how it's being used in other communities that is also needed, that people need to be able to have at their fingertips examples that they can find, if you like, some traction that they can give to people, and the people in that community can say, now I understand what a cooperative is. Okay. A couple of other points that are sort of around this in terms of how one might approach this. We think from some of the work that we've been doing on this project and another project that in the Aboriginal communities, cooperative development may be more successful, at least in the first instance, if we get people to think about cooperation amongst bands or amongst tribal councils. And start to think about that level of cooperation rather than cooperation, say, amongst individuals where they're trying to navigate within a band structure, which may be often difficult. So this is in part one way to think about, okay, well, if there's gatekeepers at one level, they may not be present at the same level, the same extent at a different level. And there was some discussion about this around, Dion was mentioning this. There is a very, very strong sense in the research that we were doing that this concept of community is expanding. If you went out into rural Saskatchewan 30 years ago, the community was your small town. And, for those of us who know corner gas, it's really captured in corner gas, right? How you spit on the ground when you say the name of your rival community. We really get a sense that that's starting to break down. People are willing to talk about how they can cooperate with other communities in their area. And there are some examples, and we had one of these where, in fact, the rural community and the adjoining Aboriginal community are, in fact, actually working together on some initiatives. These are still few and far between, but these barriers are starting to break down, and this is also part of this knowledge that's required by cooperative developers to know in a community when they can start to poke away at those issues. One of the things, and this picks up on what Darcy was saying, coming out of the results that she was reporting around the community. The community members have this really strong sense that they need to take control. And one of the things about the cooperative model, and we're finding this in some different areas where we're working with groups, that one of the things that's really attractive about the cooperative model is to say, we get to control this. This is something that we get to control. We can get to elect the board. We get to decide what is going on. And I raise this because this actually, I think, fits with with what we're calling, what we're sort of talking about as the new policy environment. Now, it's actually not all that new now. It's probably 25 years old. But the policy environment that seems to be out there is one where government is saying, we're not going to do this anymore. This idea of the state taking on all this activity, government really is trying to say, we want these communities to look after this on their own. And what communities were telling us is, okay, that's fine, but we actually need control. You can't just tell us to do this and then expect us to do this when we don't actually have the wherewithal to be able to do this. And we think that the cooperative model fits nicely within this intersection of these two aspects. It's a nice way of being able to bring these two ideas together. Okay. Now, part of this is as well that co-ops are not always the right answer to a particular problem. And what's also important is that communities are able to say, no, we don't think a co-op is going to work. And so if you want co-ops to be able to say, yes, we think co-ops are the answer, we also need to give them the ability to be able to say, no, they're not. This has been brought up a couple of times, but it's really worth mentioning. Volunteerism in these communities is in flux. Darcy talked quite a bit about what's going on in rural communities. People are not as willing to step up and serve on boards, do that kind of thing, particularly activities that take long periods of time and over an extended length of, so large amounts of time over a long period of time. They are willing to step up and do short-term things. So, plan the big event for next weekend, kind of thing. But serving on boards, less likely. And then when you go to Aboriginal communities, you find something completely different. In Aboriginal communities, the idea of volunteerism takes on a very different form. They're saying, we don't have enough employment in our communities as is. We're not interested in volunteering. We're looking for something that would be a source of some income and some revenue. And so there's a very different dynamic that has to be addressed within those communities. And we think that this is going to require the people, the players in these communities to actually take a different look at the cooperative model and maybe some of the governance structures. We don't know. Somebody's going to have to get out there and actually play with this and see what they can come up with. We can't do that here. It's going to be people on the ground that are figuring this out. Just very quickly here, we know that there's a great deal of technical knowledge and capacity to develop new co-ops in Western Canada. Though we may be a little bit short on some of the technical knowledge around Aboriginal co-ops, but that can be developed. What is the case is that the provincial co-op apex organizations, which are doing much of this development, have limited ability to influence policy and business rules that affect co-ops. So they're not very successful in terms of changing that sort of policy environment. And that's the kind of background. We've got people that have the expertise. We know that there's not going to be much happening on the policy side. We don't think the government's going to come in and provide a lot of brand new funding just for cooperative development. But we do think that there is a need for new funding to go in that's going to support this in some way, shape, or form. And we think that that there's kind of two aspects to this. One would see potentially the co-op sector saying, yes, there's more that we can do in terms of providing some of this. But I think that the other part of this is to then link this up with this new policy environment that I described in the previous slide, and say to government, okay, we know that you aren't going to support cooperative development for the sake of cooperative development, but you might be interested in supporting development because it's going to build better communities, it's going to provide the kind of things that Dion was talking about, better quality of life within these regions, provide the infrastructure for other types of economic development that's going to go on, and so forth. And we need to marry those two ideas together, where government is interested not in co-op development, but in development of communities for other reasons, and marry that with cooperative development at the same time. And find the funding that's needed to be able to unleash this expertise that does exist. Okay. Again, this is going over some stuff that we've talked about. Co-op developers exist, but they're limited by provincial boundaries. We need to start to find ways of being able to connect up the people that are working in these different geographical regions. We need to focus much more on not just, and I'm going to talk about this in just a second a bit more, we also need to be focusing on co-op development that extends beyond just getting the co-op up and running, but into a stage post-incorporation where we get many co-ops incorporating, but then they fail within the first year or two because they don't. They run into obstacles and they don't have the wherewithal to be able to get through that, even though the expertise exists, perhaps in other co-ops like them, but someplace else geographically. And we need a way to be able to connect these people up. And so that actually brings us to what we're calling our model of robust cooperative development. Let me just finish with this very, very quickly. We start with the 4 circles: inspire, explore, create, and thrive, which come from the Plunkett Foundation's view of the various stages that have to occur for cooperative development to be successful. The inspire is inspiring people in communities just to actually start to think about that they could do something in their community to make their community better. The explorer is a stage where they then start to say, well, you know, okay, let's just do more than talk about it. Let's actually explore some real concrete options, of which co-ops are one of them. Moving into a decision to actually create a co-op and incorporate and get up and running as a business, through to a thrive stage where it takes them beyond that just incorporation stage into that next sort of 5 years plus of their life cycle, where they're actually now operating in that community and working. And what we've added to this is that little group in the center called catalysts that are actually playing that key role in trying to bring people and get people doing those activities at the right point in time. Some of these catalysts are co-op developers doing traditional, what I would call traditional co-op development in Western Canada, which is helping people actually create co-ops doing the incorporation. But it's also some of those community actors that I was talking about earlier who are creating some of these conversations in communities to get people just interested in trying to solve these problems on a community basis. 2 catalysts that are actually working to connect people up that are now in this post-incorporation stage where they have to find some like people to talk about the problems that they're facing. Or, to go back to Peter's talk earlier this afternoon, to start to develop some of that cooperative education that needs to be ongoing that Peter was arguing is really critical in terms of sustaining co-ops. That activity, and this is what, again, if you think about what we were talking about, operates within a community culture where we have to understand what are the pressures and abilities of communities to be able to actually work together. We need to understand the political culture, both at the broad sort of political level in terms of the policy environment, but also that political environment within communities and gatekeepers and who's playing that particular role. We need to understand the business culture, what's going on in the business world that's going to be influencing co-ops one way or the other, through to what do we have as a cooperative culture that's reproducing and strengthening our ideas of cooperation, which in many ways, again, was what Peter was talking about at his presentation at noon. And then around this, we have drawn a big circle saying this is really about connecting up people that are doing these different things at these different points in time. This is across sectors, across cooperative sectors, but also across geographical regions, so across provinces, because these are ideas now that no longer just belong within Saskatchewan or Alberta or Manitoba or BC, but really, if you're going to be successful at this, you have to be, engaging in thrive activities, for instance, across all of Western Canada, or explore or create activities again in rural communities and Aboriginal communities alike. So that's where I'm going to leave it and open it up for questions. Thank you very much. I know, because you're taping.
Oh, I do?
Yeah.
That's right, I do. Okay, so Murray, early on, it's turned on? It is. Early on, you had a slide that showed incorporations of co-ops over the past 15 years.
Yep.
And there were none listed for Saskatchewan. Now, I know from work from the Social Economy Project, there are at least 2, the Northern Saskatchewan Trappers Association, the Opahawawisikikawak Arts Marking Cooperative in Big River. Now, does that mean they're not actually incorporated, or what? Or you just didn't find them? Because we know they're in existence. They came to our conference, the women from Omaha.
Yes.
Conference.
So these are the numbers that we got from the registrar.
Okay, so maybe they're not formally incorporated.
And so either they're not informally incorporated or the registrar didn't properly code them and we're not getting them.
Okay.
Were they incorporated within
The last 15 years?
Or they may have that's right, they may have incorporated in a place where we couldn't call them as being rural.
Oh, okay. Well, one's in La Ronge and one's in Big River. So the La Ronge one probably would fall into that category. Okay.
La Ronge would have been, no,
PA would be in PA.
PA. So if it got incorporated in
Okay. Okay.
So again, this is part of, the problem of, we were just relying to be consistent, and it's consistency of one kind. We relied on what we could get from the statistical
Okay.
agencies. But it's a great point, Nora, because it underlies what I was saying earlier. We don't have the proper kind of records being kept of what's going on in terms of incorporation that we need to have in order to be able to really talk about this stuff.
And it's possible that there may be others that we don't know about out there as well.
That is very,
that are just
very true.
operating in small. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Thanks, Marie. I had a comment and a question, and the comment is on this issue. And just to reinforce the point, from the perspective of meeting community needs, people don't actually care how something is incorporated, whether it's under a cooperative act
That's
or
right.
some other act. Governments tend to classify things according to the legislation that they use, but co-ops have adopted a definition of themselves that has nothing to do with form of incorporation.
That's right.
So that's a challenge for statistics, but I think it's probably a great idea in the development process to hold that right out there and talk about organizations that meet community needs or meet
Right.
the ICA definition of a co-op. The question I had is if you could go back to your diagram of the 4 cultures that you had at the end. I was looking at this and I was really interested in several things about the model here. And one of them that I think is really significant that you've done in the project is to continually draw people's attention to the stuff on the right-hand side that usually gets skipped over. So what happens before a co-op is created and all those stages that need to go on and who can help with those. And I've been at lots of discussions of co-op development, including very recently, where the focus is all on your lower left quadrant and who are the people who can help with the technical skills for incorporating and launching a business. So that got me thinking about whether in the project you have come up with any observations or recommendations about the skill sets that are needed by the people who catalyze these different phases, and what skill sets are needed for those that are working the right-hand side of the diagram. A person would suspect they're not the same skill sets.
Right.
So if you're trying to incorporate a housing co-op, you'd be well advised to go talk to the resource groups that specialize in housing co-ops. But there's something different about what's needed for those other functions. So is there anything in the research that enables you to comment on the skill sets for the catalysts for those functions?
Okay, team, I'll get you to jump in here as well. I mean, I can comment, but Peter, do you want to start off? Because I think you've got some. I'm going to put Peter on the spot, but because Peter's group is actually doing this, and I think you could probably describe very nicely the people at Plunkett that are doing these different things and the different skill sets that they're bringing.
I think the absolute core of that model is saying that, in many cultures, cooperative development is seen as a solitary activity, a person with a set of skills. Yet our starting point is it's a team-based activity. So, no one person can do all of those and do them all well. They can try to because they care about co-ops. So to me, it's actually you start by recognising the very, very different skills needed within there, that those who are actually good at actually communicating outwards on the Inspire side will be quite different in the skills to those who are actually able to engage at a community level to organise, explore activities, and then the technical on the create. Again, a very different concept with those on the Thrive Part. It's actually saying we need a group of people doing this. It's unfair to expect any one person to. And often that's what will happen on co-op development. You'll actually look at what's already going on and say, look, they're not doing all of that lot yet. Well, that's because they were never resourced to do that. They were resourced in one area. So absolutely, these skills are very, very different. Some are communication skills, some are community development skills, some are business development skills, but you actually need to recognise you need that variety to make it work.
I'll also add to that I think part of it is not just the skill set, it's also the position of people. So I think if you're thinking about catalysts to address the political culture in communities, you need to have people who have deep understanding about the barriers in their communities and how they work through it. And so I think some of these people, we also need to think about how to sort of access these people in the local communities that are going to be those people that actually spend that substantive amount of time and effort initially to start these co-ops and to help them sort of really get off the ground. Because I think that, especially in Aboriginal communities, is absolutely critical. It's really difficult for people from the outside to come in and really understand that right-hand side in a way that we are seeing as absolutely necessary to be able to do successful co-op development.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I'm going to answer it slightly differently, and I know that we've been talking about co-op development as sort of an activity and sort of a core group of people and with varying skill sets. But when I spoke with the co-op developers across Western Canada, and I asked them about co-op leadership, and they talked extensively about what the people look like who are cooperative leaders as opposed to business leaders. And they're very different. And they talked quite a little bit about the differences in those skill sets and how a cooperative leader talks community very strongly. That's their first thing. They work on the project, not on the they know the politics, but it's project based. It's not ego based. These sorts of things. And so I've developed actually an interesting 2-pager that distills all of those things that the co-op developers told me were very important in co-op leaders. And you can see a fairly distinct difference between that and what you'd think of as classical Dragon's Den kind of business leadership skill set.
Yep. We're done for time? Okay. Can you tell us? Yeah. If you. Well, I think I understand that our video link is going down. So if you want to get more information, I think the easiest thing to do is go to just Google the Cooperative Innovation Project or the Center for the Study of Co-ops. If you go try the latter one, you'll then be directed. You can find very, very quickly the Cooperative Innovation Project. Rather than trying to give you a long URL, just use Google. It seems to work. It seems to work. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone on the internet for tuning in. And for the group that's here, we can continue to have a conversation.